Happy New Year. I hope your 2020 is starting off with a bang. Thank you for listening to Author Stories through 2019 and all of the previous years. We had an amazing year last year and looking forward to doing bigger and better things this year. Before we get into the interview, we're going to thank a couple of sponsors who make the show possible. Please give them a shout out and look them up on Amazon and make sure that you tell them that you appreciate their sponsorship of Author Stories. At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. You're going to love this series. I love it so much. And Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it, and be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox. We're so happy to have our friend Crystal Pico Watanabe as a sponsor of the show. Crystal is one of the best editors in the business, and she has just debuted a new service that I think you'll absolutely love and will help you to up your writing game. Pico's School of Wordcraft and Editing has just debuted, and the first course is called Properly Punctuating Dialogue. It's a mini course and can be completed in just about 20 minutes. It covers the basics of dialogue punctuation. Authors can get access to the new school and the course for free by signing up for Crystal's author newsletter, Notes from Pico. Go to picoshouse.com/newsletters. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com/newsletters. More in-depth courses will be added in 2020. Make sure you don't miss a thing. picoshouse.com/newsletters. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2 are only 99 cents for a limited time. The gods are rightfully imprisoned, and Cess intends to keep them that way. But her terrorist father has other plans. Gregory D. Little's Unwilling Souls is a pulse-pounding chase through an epic fantasy world of adventure, sinister conspiracy, and a magical industrial revolution fueled by harvested human souls. Cess is the daughter of powerful parents who would very much like to kill one another and who therefore pretend she doesn't exist. An apprentice jailer of the gods, Cess spends her days learning to forge the tools needed to maintain the gods' prison. When her terrorist father attacks the prison on her 16th birthday, Cess is forced to flee after the secret of her parentage is revealed. Suddenly on the wrong side of the law, Cess realizes the very father who abandoned her may be the only one who can protect her. But some secrets are darker than parentage. On her way to find her father, Cess will uncover truths about her family and herself that will shatter her understanding of the world and risk the return of the gods themselves. Unwilling Souls and its sequel, Ungrateful God, are on sale now for only 99 cents. The third book of the series is coming early next year, so now is the perfect time to get up to speed. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2, only 99 cents for a limited time. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories, Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Julie does not love being the center of attention. She makes dresses for those who do. But when Emily, her matchmaking friend, begs for a favor, Julie can't say no. It was supposed to be just one date. She never expected to kiss the guy, then fall head over heels for him. When threats start rolling in, it becomes clear someone will do whatever it takes to break them apart. Now she's in too deep, and walking away isn't an option. But with the paparazzi and drama involved, Julie cannot help but wonder, who wants to love a billionaire? Hollywood producer Harry Jackson is not an alpha male. He's goofy, sensitive, and will move mountains to make everyone happy. In fact, he requires a whole team of people to keep him from being robbed blind. Sometimes he even needs saving from his love of bad puns. But when an enemy threatens to jeopardize his chance at love, it's time to step up and fight. He's terrified, but the thought of losing Julie scares him more. Pick up Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? The Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. And I kind of stumbled over my words there because I'm flipping through this brand new book by Patrick Chiles called Frozen Orbit. Guys, this is an amazing read. I've had a copy of it for a few weeks now. And today is release day, where you can go out and grab a copy of this book, published by Baen and written by my friend Patrick Chiles. What an amazing book. Thank you for joining me today, Patrick.
Thank you so much for having me. It really is exciting to be here.
I'm excited to have you. I love the book. I love all the stuff that you do. And, what a fantastic journey you've had. And I think we're going to have a great time talking today. But before we get into all of that good stuff, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I tell you, I've had some time to think about that. And I was trying to think of, when did I decide I wanted to take the plunge and be a writer? And I realized it went way back, and it was long before I actually started writing prose. When I was a little kid, I was into drawing comics, and I had some artistic talent, not nearly as much as people like to think I had. And if you think writing's a hard way to make a living, trying to make a living drawing comics, I think is probably even harder.
Yeah.
But I had some talent for it, and I had a lot of stories in my head. And so I would draw my own comic books, and, everybody in my elementary school loved them, but, and that was kind of a pattern I continued all the way through college. I had a comic strip at our college newspaper. I went to the Citadel, which is kind of an unusual school for anybody who knows it. It's a military school, and, which kind of made infamous by the other writer named Pat from the Citadel, Pat Conroy, right, with The Lords of Discipline, if anybody remembers that book.
Oh, yeah.
So I had started a comic strip there, and it's kind of probably gets into my science fiction proclivities. When I was a freshman, in freshman years, kind of rough there, thought, what if somebody from outer space just happened to land here in this place and thought this is what the rest of Earth was like? How screwed up would that be? And so I'm bouncing that around with my roommates, and we realized that was comedy gold. And that started something that lasted 4 years. And I didn't realize it until later, when I started, 20 years later, when I started playing around with novel writing, that I learned a lot about storytelling and dialogue from that. And when I first approached novel writing, one of the first things I'd ask myself was, do you really think you understand dialogue? How are you going to make this work? And then I realized, well, I had done it before. I just had pictures in the background instead of describing scenery through prose and so forth. So that was where I started. I think it's just always been there. And I think for me, a lot of it is imagining the world as I wish it was, things that I would love to be doing myself and am not doing for whatever reason.
Right.
Or things that I would love to see happening that aren't happening quite yet. That's kind of where my head lives. So not in reality. So, like, I replace or revoke your reality and replace it with my own.
I love that. I love that. Those early days drawing comics, did that come from a love of comics? Like, how did you discover the art form, and what was it about those stories that got you excited?
I think it was just being a hyperactive kid and drawn to hyperactive imagery.
Yeah.
Really good comic, and the imagery draws you in, and the story's done well. The story carries you along, the imagery carries you along, and I think for me it wasn't an attraction to the medium so much as I realized, this is something I can sit here and do myself on a rainy day when I'm bored, and I enjoyed doing it, and I enjoyed that process of letting my imagination just take me to places that I couldn't get to yet. And I think that's really what it was, because I'm not a big comics guy. I mean, and I never was that big of a comics guy. I mean, when I was a kid, sure, but again, I think it was just it was a medium that I realized I could do something in, and so I just kind of ran with it.
Yeah. From reading your work, you were obviously a longtime science fiction fan. You can't have work like this come out without you having breathed that and soaking it up for years. What was it that brought you to science fiction?
Well, again, I think it's a desire to see or experience worlds that don't exist just yet. The things in the kind of science fiction I'm really drawn to are the things that are right on the edge of what's possible, or even are possible right now, but we just haven't committed the resources to it, or just starting to. Like, if you look at the stuff that SpaceX is doing,
Yeah.
I mean, 10 years ago, who would have thought you'd see two boosters flying back to land on the beach in formation?
Right.
And repeatedly. And that's the kind of thing that attracts me most. I'm definitely more drawn to that sort of realism. Kind of like Michael Crichton. If you think about Jurassic Park, something that's on the edge of being plausible and believable. That's the kind of science fiction that I really enjoy. So, and I think there's a difference in the kind that I enjoy reading and the kind I enjoy watching, because I can watch, Star Trek all day long, but I never really was much into the books, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's something interesting about science fiction, and I love kind of a good space adventure that's not very plausible. We love Star Wars, but we're not to that point technologically, nor there's lots of things about Star Wars that's just probably not ever going to happen. It's a good space fantasy, and I love those kind of books, and I tend to write more like that. But I also love science fiction that expands my thinking about what things could be and bridges the gap between what is available now and what may be in the not so distant future. The Martian was a great illustration of that. Just extended far enough out that we can use our imagination, but still plausible enough that we feel like we come away from it, feeling better about the way we think about things, or and that's what I love about kind of golden age science fiction. It was hopeful science fiction. It led us to. I think a lot of the things that we see going on now with SpaceX and companies like that, largely in part, due to science fiction authors, a few decades ago, challenging us in those ways. In reading your book, Frozen Orbit, I get that same kind of feeling. Were you channeling some of your favorite sci-fi authors in telling the story?
If I was, it wasn't intentional. I will say this: probably the one author that has influenced me the most isn't really a science fiction author, and that'd be Tom Clancy. I discovered his techno thrillers, back when I was a cadet at the Citadel. And I found Hunt for Red October in the middle of finals week one year, which was about the worst possible time to find a book like that. That was a struggle. But yeah, that book really stood out in my mind, and I think I realized later it's because it essentially is kind of science fiction, even though the science he was talking about was current day, and I think there was a few things in there that were not implausible, but hadn't quite been perfected yet.
Yeah, it was fiction to a lot of us.
Yes,
whether it existed or not, we didn't know it existed.
Yes, and that he grounded it in real world, present day, political drama and international tension and that sort of thing, and that I think there's a little bit of a callback to that in Frozen Orbit, because you do have this Cold War era Soviet spacecraft that was discovered all the way out at the end of the solar system.
Right.
And the obvious question is, how in the heck did that get there? And the story behind it is something that had been rattling around in my head for a while. Because the other thing, besides the desire to tell stories about things that don't quite exist yet, I've always been a real space nerd. I'm into astronomy and high power rocketry, which is kind of like the Estes rockets you might have played with as a teenager. Yeah. Well, they're all grown up now, and they're a lot of fun. But anyway, I had been following the New Horizons mission, the first probe we ever actually got to Pluto. And the mystery behind it fascinated me, because, this was the one planet, and I'm still calling it a planet, in our solar system that we had never gotten a good image of. The best images we had were from Hubble, and those were still, looked like, 16-bit pixel cartoons. So, the build up to that arriving a few years ago was really interesting to me, because I was so curious to see what they found. And the things they did see, were, I think, amazing. But I thought, what if they saw something that nobody expected to find, that wasn't natural and obviously shouldn't be there? What would that be? What would it look like? And so that thought nagged at me for a long time. And I knew that there was a story in there as soon, once I could figure out what it was. And again, I'm not into the kind of science fiction space opera with aliens and all that, so it wasn't going to be extraterrestrials. I knew that. And then I thought, what if it was an old Soviet spacecraft, a manned Soviet spacecraft? Well, that introduces a whole lot of questions. Namely, how did they get there? Because that is a long way out there.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it took New Horizons 9 years to get there, and I think that was, other than Voyager, the fastest probe we've ever sent anywhere. Well, if anybody who's familiar with some studies back in the 60s and 70s called it Project Orion, and the idea behind that was you could use nuclear bombs to propel a spacecraft awfully fast and awfully long way. I mean, like, you could conceivably get something up to like a 10% of light speed, which is no small feat. And the Air Force is actually really serious about this. There were some declassified studies they had that I used as background for this. And that's kind of when things came together, because I thought, well, if any country was just nuts enough to try something like that, it would be the old Soviet Union.
Right.
And, and they had plenty of nuclear bombs sitting around not doing anything. And so I was able to craft a story out of that. And that's where it went. And so, I started off with, through some accidents of current day, this being discovered, and NASA realizing that, we've got images of this thing that, we just haven't processed, and they dig those up, and they They find it there in orbit around Pluto, 40 some years later, and now, the race is on. We've got to get out there and see what this is all about. If they could do it, we can certainly do it. And so they're building a spacecraft that's nuclear powered and kind of a modern, updated, less crude version of the same kind of drive system. And all this stuff is technically feasible. None of this is anything that I've made up out of whole cloth. Everything is based on current research and in some cases actual hardware that's being tested, but it's not ready to send anything out to the end of the solar system yet. But that's back to where my brain lives.
So where did well, first off, let's back up just a little bit.
Okay.
What was the first novel that you wrote?
My first novel was Perigee.
Yeah. What was the motivation behind that story?
That, again, it kind of grounded in current day. So my idea for that happened way back in early 2000s. So it was around 2003, I think, and that's when Burt Rutan had built Spaceship One, and so they built the first, fully civilian-funded and built spacecraft to get civilian pilots up above the atmosphere. And then Richard Branson went into business with them, started Virgin Galactic, and so their intention was to start selling tourist rides into orbit. And of course, Blue Origin is playing around in that space now too. Nobody's done it yet. It's been kind of agonizingly slow to get started. But one of Branson and Rutan stated one of their intentions was they wanted to eventually do point-to-point passenger travel service through space. So, which made sense to me. If you're willing to spend $250,000 for a 15-minute hop above the atmosphere, on a joyride, what if you could actually get somewhere? So, LA to Sydney in 90 minutes, that sort of thing. And so I'd been in the airline and business aviation industry for a long time, and had pretty good background in that, in airline type operations. And I thought, well, if they wanted to do something like that, it would kind of look a lot like an airline. And my imagination started running with it. Was, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? It's kind of where my head went, is what are the worst case outcomes? And partly from just my mind wandering, and then partly because this was at the point in life where I was feeling the urge to write. I was feeling the urge to tell stories again. I had been out of it for a long time, and the story started coming together. And so back to the question, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, a spacecraft that's suborbital, but somehow ends up in orbit unintentionally, or by sabotage, whatever. Anyway, you've got a spacecraft full of high dollar passengers, high maintenance people, and it's trapped in orbit. How do you get it back? Well, the problem is, well, it's trapped. You can't. So you've got to find a way to get them home, right? And I realized that the world that I had already been working in would be a pretty good starting point to tell that story. I could, I knew the personality types, and I knew the kind of background things that happen that it takes to run a kind of a complex operation like that. And there's a lot of room for drama and storytelling in there, and there's a lot of good characters. That was one of the hardest things, was to write things based on my prior experiences and not write individuals, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I didn't want people seeing their own names in there. And I still get teased about that, that, oh, you were writing about so-and-so. No, I really seriously was not. I mean, there's always going to be a few things that you can't avoid that stand out, and they're too good to not put in a book somewhere. But I didn't base any characters on any specific individuals. Um, but again, it was more about taking what they said they wanted to do and applying it to the world that I already knew and thinking about what's the worst thing that could happen. And so that's what I did.
When you written that first book, and you publish it and you get it out to the world, and now this sort of lifelong love, and eventual dream becomes a reality. What's that feeling like for you? And then when people start to read it and give you feedback, what does that do for you?
I tell you what, that was an amazing experience. It's that first time, where you taste a little bit of success and affirmation, and you want it to last forever. Yeah, and I struggled with that for a long time. And this was 2011, early 2012. So this is when indie publishing was starting to take off. The first draft, I'd had it completed for a while, and it went through a lot of iterations, a lot of rewrites. And I was fortunate enough to get some professional editing input through a friend of mine, and that fixed the story considerably. So when I finally put it out there, I was trying to get a publishing deal, and I was going through the whole querying agents and that sort of thing, and it was like high school dating, right? It was just leave such a bad taste in your mouth. Do they like me? I don't know. They're not answering. And then about that time is when Chris Rush posted an essay on her blog that I think turned a lot of people towards indie, and it was basically saying now's the time to do it. Self-publishing is not the stigma that it once was. So I started considering that pretty seriously, and got professional cover art, got some help editing, got some help formatting, and put out what I think was a pretty good product, and hit at just the right time. This was when the big wave was building up of indie authors, and it got out on Amazon, and it took off. And back when putting stuff out for free really could mean something on Amazon, and it ended up in the top 10 in the hard sci-fi genre.
Nice.
For a while, and it hit number one a couple of times. I think we kept screenshots of that.
Yeah, as everyone does, as you should.
Yes, that was so amazing to see. But I tell you what, the real joy came from the reviews. That was what I really wanted to know when the reviews started coming in, and they were very positive. And I don't mind negative reviews. If it's constructive, I want to hear what didn't you like about it. Don't ding me because you didn't like your service from Amazon. But when it started getting good reviews, that's when I knew, okay, I might actually be able to do this. And so I got started on the next book, and that's the one that got the attention of Tony at Bain. So
when and on this show we're very pro indie publishing. I'm an indie published author myself, well, hybrid, because I also have a deal with Athon Publishing. But we're also pro traditional publishing. What I love about the time that we're in now is that everyone has a choice, and the power is back to the writer. Authors now can choose what's best for them. Sometimes that's indie publishing. Sometimes it's traditional publishing. It just all depends on what works for you. So as someone who's kind of had feet in both puddles of water now, and I know that today is release day for the book, and we haven't, we'll have to follow up later to see, how things are going. But what's your experience been with Bain? And, any sci-fi fan knows Bain, knows their history, knows their reputation. We were talking before we started recording kind of about this story of getting connected with them. Why don't you share that with folks and just kind of fill us in on how it's been going for you to kind of get that view from the other side of the fence?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do consider myself a hybrid author right now because there are stories that I have that are maybe background to the books I'm writing. Like I do have one that I'm planning to do shortly here that's probably novella length. It'll probably be 50, maybe 60,000 words. And I want to tell the background story of my main Russian character from Frozen Orbit. Well, that's not long enough for Baen to publish. They want to see 100,000 words minimum. And,
because they're still thinking print runs. That's kind of their bread and butter.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And with science fiction, let's face it, you have to allow for world building and all
right.
that. So anyway, I plan to continue my full length novels with them and publish, the in between stuff independently. But the experience has been really good. My second book, Farside, which is continuation of stories from the characters that I established with Perigee. So I took this whole fictional space tourist line and built it out from there. And that was being reviewed by a newspaper writer down in Texas who used to be a NASA engineer, and he was reviewing it for his newspaper and for Ricochet.com, and he contacted me and asked if I'd mind if he forwarded on to Tony Weisskopf at Baen.
Why would you ever want that?
Yeah, geez, yes, please. and that was a real blessing because really Baen is the only publisher that I wanted to work with, and the chance to work with an editor like Tony was a really once in a lifetime opportunity. And so I was very excited at that, and he forwarded it on to them, and they contacted me a few months later, and so they republished Perigee and Farside as ebooks on their own imprint, and so those are for sale, been for sale for a while now as Baen ebooks, and so we got going on the next book on Frozen Orbit, and the process with that's been really good. It does take longer, for indie writers who are used to cranking out several a year. Even if you're working with a freelance editor, I think that relationship maybe is more tightly focused, and you probably have a faster turnaround time. That had been my personal experience. So the turnaround time here is still pretty good, but there are more people involved. There's more input, but I can say I think it's made Frozen Orbit a much better book. It's even the basic concept that started the book and the whole premise behind it are still there. It's just some of the twists and turns that it took, and how we built up to the climax at the end are different now, and I think it's a much better book for it.
We were talking earlier about the NASA New Horizons mission, and the Pluto, and the I, like you, watched all along with that, and I still have the New Horizons website bookmarked, and I just pulled it back up as you got me feeling nostalgic as we're talking, and now they're posting images of objects they're finding in the Kuiper Belt. When you first started thinking about Frozen Orbit, what were some of the Pluto mission, obviously? What other things were you using for research and to start thinking about this long journey, out to the edge of the solar system?
Well, the technical aspect of it is really important to me because, I do consider myself a techno thriller writer as much as I am a science fiction writer, and anymore the line between the two is just getting more and more blurry, I think, as time goes on. So getting getting the engineering and technical aspects of both spacecraft, the American and the Russian ones, correct was really important to me. Even though they're using technology that is just now really kind of being developed, being able to keep that accurate and extrapolate it outward, say 20 years, to what that might actually look like. That took a lot of research, and anybody who's writing hard sci-fi, if it's space-based, the Atomic Rockets website is the go-to site. It's got everything you need. It's almost one-stop shopping, and that's where I'd already known about the Orion project stuff from the 60s. I'd known about that for a while, and of course that's described there, but some of the some newer stuff is described there too. So I wanted to look at, okay, what would it take to get out there? Like I said, it's a long way. It is not something that to be taken lightly. In reality, any spacecraft that we would send out there, a manned spacecraft, it would be enormous, and most of it would be fuel.
Right.
But besides figuring out how they would get there, then it's okay. Because we're writing fiction, and it's important for things to go wrong, right?
Yeah.
You can't have everything go smoothly. What kind of things could go wrong along the way? Where are the potential hangups and places where the story can take a turn, and and our characters have to work their way through it. And so there was a lot of research on life support systems. How would you sustain people for that amount of time? A lot more medical research than I first expected. And this again were first some turns that the story takes. That was a big benefit too of having a publisher like Bain involved, because they bounced it off of different subject matter experts. And some of the feedback that I had were on some biological aspects and medical aspects and that kind of thing. And fortunately, these are all things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So that makes the research part kind of easy. It's stuff that I'm just naturally reading about anyway. So,
well, let's talk about another aspect of the book. We're pushing boundaries with the book. We're thinking about the future, what could be, what's the worst thing that could happen. As a great science fiction writer can take all of these questions and can make a great story and an informative story around it. But it takes a special kind of writer who can help you feel like you've learned something at the end of the book, but also keep you very entertained. And the linchpin to all that is characters that you care about. And you care what happens to them. You care about their part in the adventure. Because we like to, live vicariously a little bit through these characters, and we feel like we've been on an adventure with them. Jack Templeton and Traci Keene, who are they? Where did they come from? And I don't know if you've seen the movie Ad Astra. I watched it with my kids a couple weeks ago, and I was physically ill at the end of that movie because not only did the science insult me through the movie, but the way they treated their characters insulted me even more. And what should have been an amazing movie just made me mad at the end of it, which is the exact opposite reaction I have to Frozen Orbit. Talk a little bit, if you will, about the characters we meet in here, and how you balance, the air quotes nerdy or geeky stuff with a story that we care about.
Well, I'll tell you what. I felt the same way about Ad Astra.
I wanted to love it. I really did.
Oh yeah. Yes. There was so much there to work with, but they lost me. Well, the Pirates on the Moon could have been a lot of fun, but yeah. Well, I won't go down that road.
Yeah.
So
the trailer was the best part of the movie. I'll just leave it at that.
Unfortunately, though, isn't that the way things are half the time anymore?
I know. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, all the best stuff's in the trailer, and you might as well just watch that.
Right.
Yeah, I like to think that mine won't be that way if it ever comes to that.
We won't let that happen.
No, well, I had fun with the characters in this, and they kind of came naturally. I needed to keep the crew small for a number of reasons. Realistically, the less people you have, there's the less life support and consumables you need. But this isn't all about technicalities. I know I've talked a lot about the technical stuff, but there's more to the story about them going to find this old Russian spacecraft than just a salvage mission. There's the whole question of why didn't they ever come back? And I really enjoyed the mystery aspect of it. And that's one of the things that drove Jack's character is I wanted him to be like a former cryptologic linguist in the military. For those of you who don't know, a linguist obviously is somebody who translates, right? Foreign languages. A cryptolinguist is somebody who breaks codes and translates languages. And so there's some mystery aspect to this story that they've got copies of the Russians' mission logs that he transmitted back to Moscow, and then they're able to actually get a hold of some of the original transcriptions that weren't filtered through political officers and translators and all that. And so Jack is on board as their resident expert. He was really the only guy with that kind of background in the astronaut corps, so he was a natural choice. And he's a little bit of a smart aleck, which I can't seem to keep out of my characters.
I wonder why that is, Patrick.
I've heard your interviews with Andy Weir, and I identify with that a lot. There's a lot of me in there, but with both characters, because what they're going to end up struggling with here is the questions of, well, where did we come from? And, I'm not going to spoil the story, but, there are things that they find out there that point pretty strongly towards where life originated and how we got here. And it kind of leads to the question, what's our purpose as humans now? So Jack's coming at it from more of a secular perspective and a little bit of a cynic. Traci's coming at it from more of a traditional religious perspective, and they're both finding different answers in the same to the same questions from the same evidence, and so there's some ongoing dialogue with them back and forth. It develops throughout the book, and then once they get there and start knitting the threads of the mystery together, that's where some of the inevitable conflict arises. Is how do we interpret this? What do we do with it? But Jack is definitely more of a he's coming at it again more of a secular scientific perspective. Traci, I made her a country girl from Kentucky who I got to have my Southerners in my books.
Right.
I was still living in Ohio when I wrote this, and so she's coming at things more of a country girl's perspective, and I like the interplay between the two of them, the dynamics between the two of them. It's just something that naturally developed. I'm learning as I go along with writing. I think I started off as a pantser, and I'm definitely more of a plotter now. But the character development, that is something that just does kind of, I might think through the character sketch initially as to who they are, real one or two sentences, what they're all about. But the details don't really come until I've several pages into dialogue with them, and they start to reveal their personalities to me, if that makes sense.
Sure. And I love the interplay between the two characters, and I love the exploration of, you know, some of the big philosophical questions that science fiction used to be the place that you could go to and have those discussions and have those, to kind of play out what could be, what might be. And, you know, sadly, for a lot of it, a lot of science fiction has adopted the kind of fantasy grimdark, aspects where everything is hopeless and nihilistic and, you know, we're just, you know, flying through space on a rock and with no purpose. And, you know, science fiction ought to be a place where you can talk about what purpose means and what, you know, who are we? Where did we come from? Without beating people over the head with what you think about it. I really love the balance that you provided. And, you know, this book is accessible to anyone across the spectrum, no matter, you know, where they're coming from. I think that you're offering, you know, a great discussion about it in the midst of these likable characters.
Well, appreciate that. And that's something that I was aiming for. Because, message fiction bothers me, even if I agree with the message, because ultimately there's really no drama to it. You know, you know where the story is going to end up. You know how things are going to turn out. And, you know, that might work for a Hallmark Christmas movie, but but that's, you know, that's not what keeps me turning the pages. And that was one of the central questions that I found with this. And it wasn't in my mind going into it, but it was once I started it and to understand where the story was going, that's when it really hit me is, you know, the question of where did we come from, and what if we haven't found any evidence of intelligent life because there isn't any? What if we're it? What if, you know, we haven't seen it yet because we're the first? That's kind of a scary thought.
It is.
And, you know, but at the same time, it's also a very hopeful one, you know, because that implies to me that we do have purpose and we're here for a reason. And, you know, we're to go forth and prosper, be fruitful and multiply. Well, does that extend to multiplying life out, you know, farther into space? And, you know, what kind of responsibility does that put on us as a civilization? You know, like, obviously we should take better care of ourselves. Don't argue in front of the children, that kind of thing.
Right. Right. Oh man. Patrick, I absolutely love this book. And happy release day. I hope it does phenomenally well. I'm sure it will. If we're going to put links to the book in the show notes where everybody can grab their copy. It's coming out in paperback and Kindle. Do you know if there's plans for an audiobook? This would make an amazing audiobook.
I don't think there's active plans for it. I know that they're shopping it around because I have inquired about that. And, you know, Bain has just recently inked an agreement for audio versions of its books. So I am hopeful that there's going to be an audio version of this real soon. But as of now, I don't know that there is one.
If you get news about that, please let me know so I can update the show notes in the episode, because I think this would be an amazing audiobook. If folks are just learning about you and all that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Well, sure. I'm on Facebook. I've got my personal page, and it's just my name, Patrick Chiles, and I've got a Patrick Chiles Authors page on Facebook, but most of my activity is on my main page. And then I've got a blog at WordPress, the Chiles Files, and it's just
post about rocketry and all kind of good stuff.
And writing in general, and the and I try to keep it focused on that. It's too. I don't want to get off in the weeds on too much on current events and that kind of thing, because you know nobody really cares what I think. You know, what's the point? I'll talk about the things that
Right.
Bring the things that bring people together.
Right.
So,
That goes back to the don't argue in front of the kids.
Yes. So chilestyles.wordpress.com, and I'm also on Twitter, Patrick Chiles, although I'm not very active on Twitter. So I think Facebook and the blogs are probably the best way for people to find me.
Great. We're going to send everyone to see you, Patrick. The new book, Frozen Orbit, available everywhere today. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today, Patrick.
Thank you, Hank. It's been great.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right. Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.